labor history. He comes to us today with his most recently published biography, and here it is, titled Karl Marx, A World to Win, and that is published by Pearson. And Bill has got copies that he will be happy to sell to you at the conclusion of today's event for $15, and that's a deal, because online it's around $23 and change or something like that. So if you'd like a copy, Bill will be happy to provide you one.
Autographs free.
Autographs free, about that. Yes, indeed. The book covers the important aspects of Marx's life and the major theoretical arguments of his work. The book also explores the Industrial Revolution through the lens of Marx's view of socialism, not simply as an ethical idea, but also as a way of framing the industrial system and its impact on workers. So, without talking any further, without further ado, one other thing I would be remiss. For those of you that aren't on our listserv, so you can be notified about our upcoming stuff, you'll notice I lost the clipboard, but you have to make do. We got some cardboard here. Is it?
You want it?
Well, yeah, sure. Anyway, if you're not already on our listserv, by all means, just give us an email address and we'll be able to let you know what's coming up. And we're not going to bombard you with announcements, and there's nothing like that. But you'll get like 2 notifications in advance of whatever is coming up. Generally, we start these about a week to 10 days out, and then typically we send a second notice just in front of the event, maybe a couple of days before. So let's just welcome Bill. Here you go.
This is going to be recorded, so I have to do some sort of sound check. Is that it, Glenn?
No, you're good. You're good.
That's fine. Because I'm used to just screaming at people without the technology, so not to come off as a Luddite. Okay, the first thing that you may ask is, why would anybody bother to write yet another book on Karl Marx? Because there have been quite a few. So what was my idea? Well, my idea was to write a book that was brief, clear, hopefully easy to read, and try to take his work as a whole and present him as sort of an introduction to his work. In other words, there are a lot of books on Karl Marx and the nuances and vicissitudes of the dialectic. Peter, didn't you write where's Peter? Didn't you write a book, something like that on Karl? Anyhow, the point I'm getting at is this was not meant to be an academic specialist book. This was meant to be a book for general readers, for undergraduate students, and so on. And the reason I was doing it is because you hear so much about Marx, almost all of it negative. And as a historian, one of the things that you immediately start to think of is, why is it that the mainstream bourgeois press and intellectuals feel so compelled to reiterate the same arguments over and over again against Marx and his ideas? So let's put this in a context. The Roman Catholic Church argues very fiercely for what they believe in, but they've long since given up dumping on the cult of Apollo. They have safely concluded that they have defeated the cult of Apollo. They no longer have witch hunts against Roman pagan priests. Why? Because they don't have to. The reason why you keep having Marx buried under, as was once said about Oliver Cromwell in his biography, under piles of dead dogs, is because Marx still represents a threat. And I think Marx represents a threat precisely because his main ideas, however much this or that idea may have become outdated or perhaps was mistaken for this or that reason, the main thrust of his thought is still a radical challenge to the existing capitalist order. We saw this in a couple of ways. First of all, we see it with the recent crisis of capitalism. You have a situation where bourgeois magazines, as credentialed as The Economist, the Anglo-American sort of weekly Bible of the business community, where they're like sort of uneasy about Marx. They're talking about how the sales of capital are up 300% in Germany. They throw little cartoons showing the president of France, Sarkozy, of all people, running around with capital under his arm, choosing the French of perhaps going, native on them, breaking with the Anglo-Saxon bourgeois pact with Europe, and so on and so forth. And, you have all these various things. There was a best-selling book in Germany not that long ago by a man named Marx from Trier called Das Kapital. But it wasn't Karl Marx. It was actually a Roman Catholic archbishop named Marx, who wrote a book called Das Kapital, where he argues that if we do not fight to eliminate the injustices that Karl Marx talked about, Marx is going to come back, as he puts it, from the dead. And we want to keep Marx, we the Catholic Church, the conservatives, want to keep Marx buried. And if we want to keep Marx buried, what we have to do is do something for social justice. So even from an extreme conservative, his reward for doing this was that he was made cardinal later. I believe he's Cardinal of Munich now, if I'm not mistaken. And this was a bestseller on the right. So Marx's ideas have really come back with a vengeance during the recent economic crisis. Because, after all, one of the things he said repeatedly and clearly, in which he's always criticized for, he's always made fun of in, bourgeois claptrap 101 economics, is this idea of crisis. We are told over and over again, generation after generation, that capitalism and the market are now self-correcting. Right? The Rockefellers have an entire university down the Bantustan of Hyde Park called the University of Chicago, where they train economists to tell people that if the light bulb burns out, don't do anything. If it needs changing, the market will do it. And this sort of market, sort of ayatollahs, this whole idea that the market is everything, the market will always work, is something we're constantly fed. Marx said, no, that's not the case. The market will go into crisis. It's inevitable. It will go into crisis for various, economic reasons, which I'm sure many of this crowd are well aware. They've denied that. Once again, we've seen capitalism going back into crisis. Once again, Marx was proven right. But there's another thing that's interesting about Marx, is they like to say that Marx is old-fashioned. After all, he didn't have MTV, he didn't even have satellite, hell, he didn't even own a cell phone. So how could he understand the modern world? Well, if you go back to his writings, say, let's take the Communist Manifesto. I'm sure most people here in this room have read it. Very well-known work. Even in the Manifesto, not in some obscure letter to some friend one day, and in many of his other works, Marx is a prophet of globalization. He predicts, quite accurately, that what's going to happen is that capitalism will not be able to continue within local, regional, or national borders. That it will be forced by its very nature, as he says, to batter down Chinese walls, very apt quote, and spread throughout the globe. And that, in fact, if you take Marx as a prophet of globalization, and you look at his predictions versus the predictions of any of the people who were more popular than him at the time and pretended to be economists or political scientists or what have you, authors, most people did not see this globalization coming, or they only saw it as half-hearted. If you read Marx on India, long before there was a Gandhi, long before modern political currents developed, he's predicting the end of the British Raj. He's predicting the end of British imperialism, because he says it ultimately will not be able to continue. So, in that sense, I think it's important to look at Marx, because it's very easy for people to try to poo-poo him as like some old guy from the 19th century. Died a long time ago, smoked too much, whatever it might be. Enjoyed an occasional beer, perhaps too excitedly. and so on. It's very easy to do that. But if you actually look at his work, you see that it's like fundamentally the main thrust of it has been correct. Whereas most people in this room, unless somebody's really an antiquarian, would have a hard time even naming the people who were his famous, quote, competitors at the time. People who wrote reviews in the Times of London criticizing him and so on, because those names have just faded into history along with all their incorrect predictions. So, I basically don't want to talk too long. I want to leave a lot of time for discussion, particularly with a group like this. I know that we're going to have all sorts of interesting comments and questions and various, back and forth, and people can denounce me as one or another revisionist, as the case might be, and then I can come back and so on. And that's sort of intellectual back and forth is how people, sharpen their ideas and learn. But I just want to sort of sum up what I think are the main sort of points. I'm not going to go over his history. You can buy the book at a very reasonable price, and I have a history, his personal history in here. But I'm not going to go into the whole thing about, him going off and joining a fraternity, getting drunk and getting in a duel with a Junker and, having fights with sabers and so on. Even though that story's in there. War of the Time, another really good story where he gets drunk with the head of the German Socialist Party, and they go off, and decide after a while to start breaking street lamps. And the police come and, they run away and they're middle-aged. And, the police had no idea they were chasing the authors of the Communist Manifesto and the most important socialist leaders of Europe. They just thought they were some drunks. And they would have been right about that. They were completely smashed. Again, that story also is in the book. Now that I've done the commercial part, it's America, right? I see the flag. I know I'm supposed to do commercials. I'm looking for the big screen TV showing bad sports replays. I've been in Europe for 4 months, so I'm still in culture shock. You have to forgive me. Anyhow, I want to just point out some of what I think are the most important points about Marx in terms of his belief system, in terms of the ideas he pushed. And I'm giving these in no particular order. But first of all, and I think it's important to say, particularly as I see the American flag so prominently displayed almost everywhere I go, is that Marx was a believer in internationalism. In a world which still, despite globalization, despite everything else, is filled with all sorts of national hatreds, national competition, where the poison of nationalism and its ugly twin racism so pervades the world, I think it's important that Marx always stressed that the unit of analysis one should look at is class, not ethnicity, not gender. Believed absolutely in internationalism. And as we begin to reach our 10th year of war in Afghanistan, and I forget how many years we've been in any of the other countries we've been in. How long we've been in the Philippines, Kim? And one loses count after a while. There's so many counties, so many wars, so many police actions, et cetera, et cetera. 113 years in the Philippines, about the same in Puerto Rico. Okay. I won't start talking about we should give Texas back to Mexico, because then people accuse me of being anti-Mexican. But in any case, the point is that internationalism was something that Marx really pushed and really believed in. And not just an abstract internationalism like the universalism of many Christian denominations, but an internationalism that was based on the idea that all members of oppressed classes, the working class most particularly, should, for their own benefit, not just out of abstract morality, they should come together in a sense of solidarity. That workers of all lands should truly unite. Not just because it would be a nice thing, but because that's the only way they're going to succeed. If in the 19th century, French miners could not win strikes unless they could win over Belgian miners to not come and scab on their strikes, it's certainly true that, let's say, workers in the United States are not ultimately going to be very successful unless they can build bridges to, say, Asian workers who are also working for the same multinational corporations that they are. Same with European workers, have to build bridges not only across Europe, but with the Americas and, of course, with Asia. Without that, it'll be divide and conquer. That old story of playing one group off against another. Honda workers in Ohio played off against Honda workers in China. So he understood that. And along with that, of course, means that you have to fight against imperialism, you have to oppose the idea of powerful nations coming in and taking over less powerful nations and then turning them into cheap labor camps. Also, he rejected racism. Now you have to remember that, yes, and I talk about this in the book, he'd make this or that offhanded comment or use politically incorrect language as we would see it in the 21st century. But it was very interesting, his most popular of all his sort of in-laws and relatives, the guy he confided in most was Paul Lafarge, who considered himself mainly African. He was French, but he was heavily African by birth, and he always said, Lafarge is very proud of this, I consider myself first of all a Negro, but today would say an African, of African descent. And so if you actually read that, this is a good example of Marx not particularly being a racist personally, because you can always drag out this or that quote where he says, oh, that Frenchman, or oh, that Greek, or, you know, the sort of thing that most of us, you know, leave for our internet conversations. But he put it in writing and letters. But when it really came down to it, he absolutely opposed racism. Supported the North in the struggle against the South precisely because of the issue of slavery, saying that you had to destroy slavery if the United States was going to advance, had to destroy slavery if the white working class in the United States was ever going to achieve anything. Also, another point we sometimes forget, particularly around election time, many people in this room forget it, he believed in independent political action. He didn't believe there was any future in radicals, workers, dissidents, tying their wagons to the established parties of capital. He didn't say this again because of some abstract moral position, but he just said it in a very practical sense, that if you don't have independent organizations, you would just be swallowed up by these larger groups, however well-meaning they might be even, and then in the end you have nothing. That you always have to have independent organization. That means trade unions, that also means political action. It even means things that we now consider something that people don't engage in, but neighborhood groups, cultural societies, you know, singing groups, educational groups. He was a very popular lecturer on the educational talk circuit, you know, sort of things like this, you might say, where he'd give explanations of his theory of the law of value, what have you, to people. So independent political action, independent organization is necessary. And why I say we forget it is it's because it's so easy, of course, to say, well, this guy who's running on this ticket is so horrible, is so terrible, that this other guy can't be as bad. And of course then, if you elect the guy who can't be as bad, you often find out he's just as bad or worse. Or, as Malcolm X said, although I don't know if he was quoting Marx or trying to paraphrase Marx, if they want you to take the fox, they show you the wolf. So, I mean, I think this is, I know this might be a matter of debate. Somebody might wave yes we can signs at me or something. You know, yes we can bomb other countries. Yes we can ignore the labor movement. Yes we can sell out the workers. You know. Yes we can forget about fighting for civil rights. Yes we can point all my friends to good positions. Yes we can turn the Treasury over to Goldman Sachs. Yes we can. In any case, the argument Marx made was for independent political action, organization. Now that, on the other hand, did not mean he was some sort of raving lunatic who just believed in action for the sake of action. Most specifically, he didn't believe in propaganda of the deed, which is what anarchists promoted, or what we commonly call today terrorism. He didn't believe that individual acts of violence would achieve anything, that rather they just serve as an excuse for the ruling class to crack down on the progressive movement. Completely rejected that. When people hear about his fight with Bakunin and the anarchists, sometimes it's sort of spun as if it's just some sort of personality dispute, which I suppose on a certain level it might have been. But there's also something very fundamental. And the fundamental point was that Marx did not want any organization he was involved in to have anything to do with groups that promoted or condoned individual violence. He saw it as counterproductive, he saw it as immoral, and he also saw it as theoretically missing the point. That is to say, kill one boss, they'll be replaced by another boss. So, like, what is the point of that? And it also, he saw it politically counterproductive, it demobilizes the mass of the population. It puts them back in this sort of plebeian patron client type situation where they sit around and wait for, this select group of propaganda Adidists, whatever, Red Brigades more recently perhaps, or whoever, to do their work for them, right? Gee, I hope somebody comes and blows this guy away. Meanwhile, you sit and do nothing. So he opposed terrorism. He believed very much in the need for the economic organization of the working class, not just independent political action, but as I mentioned before in passing, that you needed economic organization. I just came back, as I mentioned, I was fortunate enough to spend 4 months in Europe. And Europe has something called trade unions. Now let me explain how this works. A trade union is where a group of workers, like in the same industry or the same factory, they join together and pool their power to try to force concessions out of management. Everybody's looking at me blankly. Maybe some of the older people in the room remember trade unions. There were trade unions in the United States for a while.
Didn't you
right?
make a mistake? Didn't you mean to say forced concessions from their workers?
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to say forced concessions from the workers. No, I wasn't talking about the AFL-CIO.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, wonderful. No, the idea of independent trade unions, I mean, it's amazing. But when I was in Europe, I actually saw demonstrations and protests and sit-ins and various things done by these unions trying to force various concessions, whether it's demanding that they don't, lay off bus drivers in Seville, or this thing or that thing. I understand in the United States every once in a while they sign petitions online, but in any event, he was always for the economic organization of the working class. He was always for trade unions. He was always for pushing this. He always said that they too, of course, had to be independent. Right? He didn't see them merely as some sort of adjunct to a political party necessarily, but that they had to represent the workers that they had organized. And I think that's an important thing, because the Marxist conception of trade unions, which is of course a big topic in and of itself, is very different than the sort of Kraft top-down Gomper's AFL conception of trade unions that tended to predominate in the United States. In fact, tends to predominate in most Anglo-Saxon countries. Very different. The idea of trade unions isn't what we would think of. In other words, trade unions in the United States, or Great Britain even, tend to be more seen as service organizations. I'm in the American Federation of Teachers, and they're always sending me stuff saying that they can get me a good rate on a MasterCard, or that if I want to buy a new car, they can get me 5% off if I buy American. Things like that. They were more seen as organizations to try to mobilize the workers to understand their conditions and then fight against them. Whether they always succeed or not is a completely different issue. Often they failed, often they lost, of course. But this relates to another thing that I think is a valuable contribution to Marx, his belief in the class struggle. He didn't believe that, you know, the capitalist lion and the proletarian lamb were going to lie down together in peace. He thought that you had a fundamental problem in all class societies, including, of course, capitalist class society, and that is the small group that owns the means of production are inevitably, maybe there'd be one or two different sort of eccentric individuals, a Robert Owen, whoever, but by and large, they're going to dedicate themselves to maximizing their profit, which means, as much as possible, holding down or reducing their wage bill. And that this just is inevitable. And of course, as Marx points out, should someone be a nice person and decide that he or her does not want to treat their workers like that, the problem is, in the long run, they tend to be driven out of business by somebody more ruthless who will. So I could open up a company, and I could pay people $40 an hour plus benefits to, I don't know, be stock clerks or something. And I could do all these wonderful things, supposedly, but I would have to then compete with corporations that were not only not paying legal minimum wage when they could get away with it, but like Walmart were forcing people to work overtime without being paid, locking in workers, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And in the long run, you obviously then would have a problem. So he understood, not that he was the first, and he never claimed he was the first, but he understood and popularizes the idea that there is a class struggle out there. It is not a question of nice people versus nasty people, right? So the Republicans may be nasty people in many cases, and some of you may think some of the Democrats are nice people. But if you're from Chicago and you've actually met these Democrats, you might think twice about thinking they're so nice. But in any case, you know who our current mayor is, right? The fact is, it's a matter of class position. Right? If Goldman Sachs is going to own the president, it really doesn't matter what party he's from. Right? Big business is going to own the mayor of Chicago. It doesn't matter whether he likes to give contracts to his son or sends dead fish to people he doesn't like. I mean, these are all just personal quirks, right? Fact is, they're going to serve who pays them. That's the nature of things. That's the nature of things. So the fact that there's a class struggle, I mean, maybe I'm belaboring this. Most people in this room probably believe there was a class struggle and so on. But, you know, we're often told hundreds of times a day on television, the press, by co-workers and billboards, by the popular culture in 1,000 direct and indirect ways, that no, there's no class struggle. There's good people and there's bad people, and maybe there's good nations and there's bad nations, you know, nationalism. But, you know, this class thing, that doesn't really matter anymore, because after all, many people today get to, you know, wear white shirts to work. So they can't be workers, right? Only be a worker if you wear a blue shirt or some silly thing like that. So understanding the centrality of the class struggle to all of human history was one of Marx's great contributions. Along with that, analyzing it in a dialectical method, the method he philosophically took from Hegel, makes him much deeper and richer philosopher than he could ever be if he had followed a linear Aristotelian type philosophical model. And I'll leave philosophy, given some of the people here, I won't go any more into philosophy for risk of saying the wrong thing and then getting killed during the Q&A. But it's important that he uses the dialectical method. It's a very important thing. It's also important that he understood the theory of labor exploitation. The main thrust we get in the Anglo-Saxon world historically is that there is a fair wage, and there are good jobs, and there are bad jobs. What Marx understood, and understood very clearly, and tried to popularize, is that you may get a good job, and you may be getting what everyone says is a fair wage. That does not necessarily mean you're not being exploited. that doesn't mean that somebody isn't making money off your labor. It doesn't mean that somebody isn't expropriating your labor for themselves, turning your labor into their capital. And I think that that's a mistake that people often have. They think, they confuse exploitation with extreme oppression. You don't have to be a Roman slave in the salt mines to be exploited. You can be exploited with a degree in computer science. You can be exploited as a highly paid unionized worker, if there are any left, but assuming there are. Because exploitation means you're not receiving directly or indirectly through societal things, such as public parks or whatever, you're not receiving directly or indirectly the full value of what you produce in goods and services. And I think this is something, too, that people often forget. They think, quite naturally enough, do I have enough money to go out to eat tonight, or do I not? And that's a perfectly reasonable way we all look at things. Do I have enough money to buy a new car, or do I have to take out these heavy payments to try to pay off my Honda Fit? Right? So that's an obvious human way of looking at it. But whether you can buy your Honda Fit with cash because you're so well paid, or whether you have to take it out on credit so you can also give the financial bourgeoisie their pound of flesh, the fact is that has nothing to do with whether you're being exploited in the workplace. And this is something I think that Marx stressed and is important for us to remember. But it's not as if any of this that we've been talking about happens in a vacuum. It happens within a certain type of society, and that is a state society. And I don't mean the state of Illinois, I mean a society with an organized set of powers. As Engels once said, the state in the final analysis is nothing more than a body of armed men. Today, thank goodness, we've made progress. We could amend that to say the state is nothing more in the final analysis than a body of armed men and women, because this is a big advance. So we have to remember the role of the state. The state is not neutral. The judges are not neutral. The police are not neutral. The army is not neutral. The courts aren't neutral. Our politicians aren't neutral. The whole apparatus is not neutral. It is set up, it is established for certain purposes. And that purpose, you could read the Constitution if you have insomnia, is to protect property. And everything about the state is geared towards protecting property. Just like many police departments, I think in Chicago they still do, they have little slogans, we serve the bourgeoisie and protect their property. Sometimes they shorten it to serve and protect, but you know, the message is still pretty much the same. The state is there in order to protect those that have property. That is its role. Right? You can't change its role any more than you change Lake Michigan into lemonade by throwing some lemons into it. You can't change it by getting an honest judge, even though that would be nice to have an honest judge here and there, or a good politician, which again would be nice, you know, sort of thing to have. The fact is that the state, by its very nature, is set up to protect the people who run and own society. So when you're talking about change, you can't see the state as neutral. And that's a mistake that I think people often make. You just don't think of it. You think, well, you know, if we had better people in there, this or that, it would make a big difference. Well, no, not necessarily, because that's why so many states, not all of them, have written constitutions, but so many states have constitutions. Because the constitutions are meant to essentially skew the game in a way that guarantees that things will turn out the right way, that guarantee the protection of property, guarantee certain interests get represented. So, for example, the United States Constitution always had this fear, and that fear was the House of Representatives. The fear of the House of Representatives is it was elected originally one white man, one vote, then later one man, one vote, then later one adult human citizen, one vote. I mean, there was some element maybe of democracy involved with the House of Representatives. And you can look this up in the Federalist Papers. People were worried about this. What if the people decided to elect a bunch of people who are going to change all sorts of things to the House of Representatives? That's why you have the Senate. Now, the Senate is the place where cattle herds, wild horses, and toxic waste dumps all get representation. What I'm saying is about 18 of the 50 states are inhabited by human beings. The rest, like Wyoming, are basically a few dude ranches and some wild animals or toxic waste dumps. Don't take my word for it. You can look in this library or go online. Just get a list, and there's any number of these lists from various sources, of the states listed by population. And pretty soon you'll find out after between 15 and 18 states, you will run up the majority of the U.S. population. Then you'll be left with those metropolises of Rhode Island, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, etc., etc. So you have a minority of the population, a rural minority of the population, controlling the Senate. That's a safeguard. That's a check and balances, as they would teach us. So again, that's part of the way the state is going to be set up. Make sure nothing happens. Then, of course, we have the president, not chosen by the people. Like France is a strange electoral system for president. They let people run for president, and sometimes as many as 15 different candidates run for president. Last time there was an election in France, there were 3 Trotskyist communist parties running and 3 fascist parties running. It's France, right? Then, basically, the top 2 vote getters, if nobody gets 50%, which nobody ever gets, they have a runoff. And whoever gets the most votes in the runoff becomes president of France. Now, the screwy thing about this is, this means that the majority of votes go to the guy who becomes president. And I can see people are looking puzzled because we know we should have an electoral college where, in 1876, 1888, and 2000, some other cases dispute, arguably, the guy who gets the most votes doesn't get to be president. Because after all, sometimes it just turns out that, Sam Tilden from New York might not have the best interests of the southern states, an industrialist at hand, so let's not make him president, et cetera, et cetera. Who wants Grover Cleveland, et cetera, Gore, of course. So, that's the other thing. We have safeguards, and the French have their safeguards too, but I'm using American examples, within the state, and the idea is the state is set up in whatever specific form historically it came about, so as it could protect property. In the United States, it has all these quirks because it was set up to defend property in the form of human flesh, that's to say slavery as well. So we have to always remember the role of the state. And one final point, and then I'll open it up for questions and discussions, in terms of Marx's contribution, is that he understood the Industrial Revolution. Why I say that is, most people either had a blind acceptance of the Industrial Revolution, and still do, and say, well, no matter how much suffering takes place, it's all for the good in the end. While other people would have the opposite reaction. They'd say these machines are evil, they're costing us jobs, they're destroying our way of life, technology is bad. We should hold back technology. What Marx understood, as few people actually did at the time, and in some way even since, is that the Industrial Revolution technology opens up tremendous human possibilities, but only if it's under the people's democratic control. Only if it's used for human needs, not used for profits. That the Industrial Revolution, in and of itself, is not either good or bad. It is a historical development which can be used for good or bad. And that what you should do is not reject technology, but use technology to free human beings from pointless toil, pointless tasks, from death, from illness, etc., etc. In other words, that you should use technology not for more nuclear weapons, or not for more predator drones to blow up carpet salesmen in rural Pakistan or something, but rather you should use the technology to try to advance humanity, whether that means education, health, culture, what have you. Any myriad of ways we could think of. I think that's something we forget of too, because sometimes, you hear people say, well, Marx was okay, but, he didn't understand the importance of technology. He was against technology. He thought we could go on doing this by hand workshops and stuff forever. Well, that isn't true. Marx embraces technology along with embracing globalization, but understanding it in the context of a democratic globalization, a people's industrialization, not the one run by the capitalists. Now, obviously, as you can tell, I could go on forever, but I won't, right? Various attempts to build socialism in one country have been failures. I won't attempt to build socialism in one speech. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open it up for questions. So if you've got a question, a comment, whatever, just come on up here. This is going to go up on YouTube, so we're going to use this added volume. So please also try to limit your questions and or comments to maybe 2 minutes, because there's like 40-odd people in here right now. And we have approximately an hour up till about 4:30. So as a courtesy to others, give everybody a chance to get up here and say something.
Well, I can tell that you've had a great impact by the number of people lining up to ask questions and make comments. It's quite...
This is great courtesy.
Yeah, great courtesy.
Wow. Go ahead.
Aha. The first to draw blood.
You were talking about the French presidential election, the structure of the presidential election. Were you implying it was a more democratic system to elect that way? Because you're also mentioning our mayor here, and we recently had an election here where I think we have the same system here for electing the mayor. I was wondering how that system serves.
Well, we don't have the same system here. We don't have. You're not allowed to run officially as political parties in Chicago anymore for mayor because they want to build more of a personality cult, et cetera, et cetera. And what I was implying is that every state has its own historically developed apparatus because of the French Revolution, which was a massive social revolution. They have to take more popular forms in France, right? So at least you get the chance to vote for somebody you agree with in the first round. But no, of course it's not ultimately democratic.
Well, if you could analyze the change in the structure of the election of the mayor of Chicago, now that the system may now serve property interests.
Okay, well, 1917, on the cusp of World War I, America's entry into World War I, you had a problem, and it was a problem that was solved the old-fashioned Chicago way through vote fraud, and that was that the Chicago Socialist Party and various radical allies were purged to essentially take over municipal government. This was a combination of sort of an ethnic vote. German Americans were very strong in Chicago. They didn't want to go kill Uncle Heinz, that sort of thing. Socialists were very strong in the trade unions. William Rodriguez was head of the Chicago Federation of Labor. He was also the socialist candidate for mayor. He was a Mexican American. Just, point out that out in terms of multi-ethnic things and so on. Well, the problem the socialists had, or rather the problem the anti-socialists had, I guess, is that the socialists could put up, like a railroad worker, who nobody knew outside his shop, right? And they just put him on the Socialist Party ticket, and the people who went in and voted socialist. They didn't vote George or Tom or Mary. You see what I mean? So what they start doing, and this is a trend throughout U.S. history, not just in the United States, more recent actually in Chicago, is they start taking and eliminating the possibility of using party labels in municipal elections, which means that name recognition, which of course equals money, right, and notoriety, is much more important than what your policies are. So, for example, when somebody runs for mayor of Chicago and they're not one of the major candidates, supposedly, you don't often have any idea what they stand for. So I'll go into a ballot box and I'll see a list of names for, let's say, the water district, okay? In the old days, I could just go and vote socialist or something, but if it's for some office and it's nonpartisan, right? I mean, I don't know who these people are or what they stand for. That was what I was sort of getting at. You know, if it doesn't work, we just change the rules.
Marx had some brilliant analysis of the core social issues at the time, but predictions, in my opinion, is the very area that he failed. There are predictions that will say something about something that is going to happen in the future, and there are predictions that are hypothetical.